All right, our next speaker is Sikivu Hutchinson, an educator and author. I had the pleasure of meeting Sikivu in Washington, D.C. for an African Americans for Humanism event. And after seeing her speak, I knew we had to get her on the Speakers Bureau. She's actually planning an event to speak in southern Alabama, and we're really looking forward to that one. But she's also the author of Imagining Transit, but she has a new book out, just 2 days ago? Really recent, Moral Combat, Black Atheists, Gender Politics, and the Value Wars. It's going to be right up there in the back. I'm sure she'd love to sign it for you as well. I see some of you holding it. That's good. She's also the editor of blackfemlens.org and a founder of the LA Black Skeptics and a fellow for the Institute of Humanist Studies. Please welcome Sikivu Hutchinson.
Good afternoon. So it took a bit of an act of God to find this campus. My spouse and I, we got waylaid. We saw Cal Lutheran University, a big sign on the 101 in Woodland Hills. So we were engaging in a lot of intense prayer to get here. My talk is called Beyond Kumbaya, Culturally Relevant Humanism. And I'm really addressing the bulk of my comments to the young people in the room because you are the next generation of activists, leaders, and intellectuals in the secularist movement. And my emphasis is going to be on linking humanism with social justice. How do you develop a critical consciousness as young people in the 21st century with all of the challenges and issues and divisions that bedevil the United States and globally? So this is going to be the framework. I have 4 bullet points here. I'm not going to belabor these too much. But first of all, what is culture? Why is it important? How does culture inform the way that you position yourself in the world? How does the dominant culture inform the way that you position yourself with regard to your sense of subjectivity and also in terms of privilege and power? How can you, as young people, make culture visible through unpacking invisible knapsacks? Some of you may be familiar with Peggy McIntosh, who is a white professor. And many years ago, she came up with this concept of the invisible knapsack as a metaphor for power and privilege that white people enjoy. So that's something that will be a recurring theme within this talk. As many of you may know, this is Black History Month. You may be aware of that because of the preponderance of McDonald's ads and schlocky tributes to MLK that have been trotted out ad nauseum. For most of white middle America, Black History Month is a blip on the screen or a 28-day travelogue before things settle back down to business as usual. In fact, after the election of Barack Obama, there was much speculation about whether or not Black History Month was still relevant. Was it redundant now that there was an African-American family in the White House, a first family, and Sasha and Malia were the new girls next door? But nobody ever called Bill Clinton rib-eating, philandering, good old boy, backwoodsy Bill Clinton a bone-in-the-nose bongo-playing savage. And no one ever caricatured Hillary Clinton, I don't believe, as a monkey or a missing link. Yet, of course, these were some of the prevailing images that emerged after the election of President Obama. And these are images that really underscored that we continue to be several highly segregated Americas, divided by race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. And despite the claims of the mainstream media that we all of a sudden morphed into this post-racial, kumbaya, colorblind utopia as a result of an African American being elected, that these divisions are really what define what it means to be an American in the 21st century. So some white people, after the election, woke up and staggered into the new dawn of an African American president and proclaimed that the dark clouds of apocalypse were descending upon the United States, that the end times were near, okay, using millennialist, hyper-religious language like that. a plague of locusts were coming to the United States. A serious planetary misalignment had occurred, and we needed to take back our country. So a lot of people of color, of course, were scratching their heads about that exhortation. But egregiously enough, there were a lot of white liberal and white progressive pundits who assessed this backlash and dubbed it to be a populist uprising rather than a white nationalist insurgency. Because if you recall all of those Tea Party confabs, all the demos and other outbursts, nary a speck of color to be found, but yet this was a populist uprising. So according to the Public Religion Research Institute, 44% of Americans believe that discrimination against whites has become just as bad as against so-called minorities. 75% of those identifying with the Tea Party believe this to be the case, and white evangelicals were the only religious group with a majority that believed discrimination against whites was just as significant as that against minorities. A large number of Americans, according to Public Religion Research, also believe that God has granted the United States with a special mission, a special destiny in global history. And so what all these currents underscore is the connection between white supremacy, white nationalism, and white Christian evangelical fundamentalist activism. And these are all currents that, of course, have had a tremendous impact on the trajectory of American politics over the past several decades. So regime change begins at home. And circling back to this theme of African American history and its import with regard to the construction of democracy in the United States, this is one of my free thought heroes. Anybody know who he is? A. Philip Randolph. So in the 1920s, A. Philip Randolph sponsored this really interesting essay writing contest for his journal, The Messenger. And it was called, "Is Christianity a Menace to the Negro?" To repeat, is Christianity a menace to the Negro? And this was in the late 1920s. And of course, I love that essay title. But is it really fathomable in this era of prayer cult nation hyper-religiosity, for that kind of essay writing contest to exist? So this was an era in which there were commies, plotting behind every bedpost. It was better to be dead than red. And political radicals were equated with being godless, okay, and vice versa. So Randolph had to adjust to the realities of the era, okay, the realities being that this was the height of institutionalized racial apartheid. African Americans were systematically disenfranchised from participating in white-dominated social, political, and cultural institutions. The black church played a seminal role in political organizing, played a huge role in providing social welfare and laying a foundation for community, professional, and interpersonal connections amongst African Americans. And so as a result, Randolph has to downplay his secularist beliefs, to try and generate a community base, around an organizing paradigm. Randolph, of course, goes on to form the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which is one of the most influential African American trade unions in the United States. Again, African Americans shut out of white-dominated trade unions. He went on to initiate the March on Washington movement, which preceded the 1963 March on Washington that most people are familiar with, that MLK gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. So Randolph was bedeviled by, obviously, a lot of federal attention, if you will, a lot of investigation into his radical activities. If we fast forward now into the 21st century, we're seeing a continuation of this religious, right-wing, reactionary, fascistic connection between political, not radicalism now, political liberalism, and secularism / godlessness, that the Michelle Bachmans, Newt Gingrich, Glenn Beck, obviously the medievalist Sarah Palin, have all continued to flog this theme that being politically liberal as far as policy making is concerned is somehow tantamount, to being a godless infidel heathen. And this is a theme that obviously has been flogged a lot when it comes to Obama. If we look at the demonization of Barack Obama, there's not only, again, this equation being made, between his policies, Obamacare equaling socialism, equaling communism, but also the taint of otherness is always apparent there. It doesn't really matter if Obama bends and twists himself to portray himself as this uber Christian. He will never, ever be Christian enough for the white heartland. He'll never be secular enough for the birthers. He'll certainly never be white enough to pass, even if we were to ladle out the blue blood DNA of his mother. Within the white supremacist logic of American cultural ideology, one drop continues to make you whole. I recently did a teacher training professional development workshop at South LA High School. And this particular high school has a predominantly African American, Latino population, high population of homeless young people, high population of young people who are on probation, very low 4-year college going rates. And there was a discussion, an argument actually, that erupted between two teachers about whether or not the United States was in fact a Christian nation. And this was in response to something I said about public education being heteronormative, meaning that the dominant culture valorizes and privileges heterosexual relationships, family organization, social actors, historical figures, what have you. So the issue was that these two teachers were going at it. An African-American female teacher defended the view that the U.S. is a Christian nation. A white male teacher who is notorious for making paternalistic, racist comments about his students, loudly proclaimed his non-belief and argued, of course, that the U.S. is steeped in the separation of church and state. And while this argument was going on, I was very mindful of the dynamics and power and privilege when it comes to being explicit about one's non-belief. That even the most politically disreputable white person who claims non-belief is not going to surrender their universal subject status, their claim to being human. That there aren't a lot of racial consequences for doing so for white non-believers. There may be political consequences, but not racial consequences. That you could be the most flag-burning, anti-American, in the mind of the fascist right, anti-American, commie-pinko infidels, okay, and still be considered to be human. Whereas the paradox for African-American non-believers for much of our experience in the United States, for much of our trajectory within U.S. history, is that Christianity, paradoxically, has been this pathway to being American, to being considered moral, to being a citizen. And being American, being and becoming American, has been an insurance policy for being considered human. And what better insurance policy or initiation into becoming American than that old-time Christian religion? White children could get an introduction into, could get a taste into being American and American justice and that old-time religion in one bloody serving during the deep Jim Crow South era, where you had congregations that would gather, would bring their picnic baskets, would bring their binoculars to view public lynchings. And this would be a form of theater, a form of performance art, a form of community ritual. It would educate young white people into what it meant to be white and what it meant to be free. Because the family and the congregation that prayed together and lynched together stayed together. Some of you may be familiar with Alice Walker's short story, The Flowers. And it's a very powerful short story where she evokes the horrors of a young African-American girl who discovers the decomposing corpse of a lynching victim while she's out picking flowers. And Walker quite eloquently and simply alludes to the savage paradoxes of a nation that deems itself to be exceptionalist, yet covers up this legacy and the contemporary resonances of this legacy under the guise of democracy and freedom and justice for all. And she concludes the story with a very simple parting salvo, and then the summer was over. That's the last phrase in this very short story, about 2 pages. And what struck me about that story, again, thinking about this trajectory of the past legacy of racial apartheid and the contemporary resonances, what struck me about that story is that not only is she summoning this issue of the end of summer figuratively, but she's also evoking this issue of innocence never ever being a possibility for young African Americans. The idea that to be a black child in particular, and to be a child of color in general, is to exist within this position of not being invested with childhood innocence, of being dehumanized, of being othered, of being made to be invisible within the dominant culture, and of being criminalized. Summoning this issue of how it is that in the 21st century, we are the greatest nation on the planet, but we have scores and scores of young people, African Americans, who are being slated into a prison pipeline, a cradle-to-grave prison pipeline. 40% of the incarcerated population is African American, including youth, while we have 11 to 14% of the general population being African Americans. So when people of color hear exhortations about taking back our country or restoring honor, and that was an evocation from Glenn Beck, restoring honor in the name of God, guns, lower taxes, and bloody fetuses. These are the kinds of legacies that come to mind. Moving back to this issue of cultural relevance, these are some of the themes that I wanted to circle back to. This issue of morality and ethics. Morality and ethics being associated with social justice, okay, striving for anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-heterosexism, and economic justice. This notion that we are not the world, that everyone does not share, quote unquote, American values or Western values, that in some parts of the globe, those values are viewed as being dominating, as being oppressive, as being dehumanizing. Being critically conscious of that, and being critically conscious of how that operates within the United States context, where again you have this massive population of young people of color who will never ever have the privilege to sit in a university like this because they don't have access to college preparation classes, because they don't have access to teachers who are highly qualified, because they come to school traumatized by violence in their communities, with mental health issues that are not being effectively dealt with within school administration, school leadership, or even the curriculum. And because they don't see themselves represented within that curriculum as social actors. Being aware that, again, American history is defined by paradox. Okay, this paradox of this great nation, okay, that supposedly affords all of these opportunities regardless of whether one is coming from a working class background, a Latino background, an LGBT background. There's a paradox there because this is not a meritocracy. Power and identity are intersectional. We're going to do a very short exercise on that in a moment. Sexism, racism, heterosexism, and classism are interlocking systems of power. Again, if we look at representation of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered issues within the mainstream media, there's invisibility when it comes to communities of color. What are the interlocking dynamics of who is valued, again, within the dominant culture's discourse about sexuality? Organized religion feeds off of capitalism and other interlocking systems of power. This is a linchpin here, because if we look at communities of color, a lot of white atheists might ask, okay, well, why are people of color embracing these systems of psychological colonization? You know, Christianity, Catholicism, what have you. We look at our communities and we see that social welfare resources are not the same as they are in middle class and more affluent white communities. And that's where the church comes in. That's where the church enters into the interstices because of global capitalism.